There are several unhelpful ways of thinking about how theology relates to science. And in this video, I want to talk about one of them, which interestingly is often viewed very positively. You can call it the sort of dialogue model. People often think very positively about the dialogue model, and I want to offer a critique of it. But before we get there, let me just briefly talk about a couple other models that are even worse. The worst of all is undoubtedly what is commonly called the conflict or warfare model, which construes or views theological claims as very badly formed scientific claims. So for example, a claim God made the universe is just a very bad scientific theory. And in fact, we have better theories in science for the origin of the universe, which have totally eclipsed any need for the theological explanation. So on this model, theology and science are in battle. They're in warfare, fighting for the same territory, for the same space to explain it. And science always wins and theology always retreats. And so there's the warfare. That's a very bad, unhelpful way of thinking about theological claims and their relationship to scientific claims. Well, there's another view, really the exact opposite in a sense of this, which is the independence model, what Stephen Jay Gould famously referred to as non-overlapping magisteria, or NOMA. And this model says, well, in fact, there is no conflict. And by definition, there can be no conflict between theological claims properly formed and scientific claims, because theological claims are value claims. Scientific claims are fact claims. Theological claims, they might deal with the heart in terms of the emotional center of a human being. Scientific claims deal with the heart as an organ that pumps blood through the body. Theological claims might deal with, experiences of your mind. Scientific claims deal with the brain. They're just dealing with different areas, different spheres of reality. Now, this isn't, I think, quite as bad as the warfare or conflict model, but it's still a very crude and I think ultimately unhelpful model, because theological claims do have purchase on reality. They do make fact claims and not simply value claims. And you can't simply, by fiat or by definition, absolutely separate these into two non-overlapping magisteria. Well, this brings me to a view that many people then want to go to, and that is often called a dialogue model, where theology and science are dealing with overlapping spheres and they have a back and forth dialogue together. And at points on a dialogue model, science makes particular insights about the nature of reality, which form theology. And at other points, theology makes particular insights that inform science. Now, there's some truth here. There's certainly a lot of truth here. And I'll say more about that in a minute. But the problem I have is that often the way that the dialogue model is cashed out is with the assumption that theology, we can expect it to make certain claims or advances that will require the revision of scientific theories, just like scientific advances can require the revision of theological theories. And if you have that as a starting assumption, that both science and theology should be changing one another in this sort of very one-level way, I think that what you're going to find is that there is a pretty stark asymmetry. That in point of fact, what really happens is that science changes, and then it forces changes in your theological theory. So for example, once you accept neo-Darwinian accounts of evolution, you need to think again about the nature of creation, things reproducing after their own kinds, the origin of human beings, the image of God, things like that, or the nature of the fall. But you don't have that same symmetry going in the other direction, where theological claims make an advance that now requires some change or new insight for science. I don't think that you have that kind of dialogue model in the way that people popularly envision. And there are many people who have lightened upon this fact and have used it as a way to critique theology and its claim to make advances in understanding about the world. So for example, I'm going to be quoting from my book, Conversations with My Inner Atheist. One of the chapters is titled, "If Theology is True, then why is it always changing in light of science?" The book is a dialogue between a fictional atheist and, in fact, my inner atheist, or Mia, so an internal voice within myself, and then myself, right, my own views. And we're dialoguing on this. And so on this question, if theology is true, then why is it always changing in light of science and not vice versa? So I'm sort of conceding the point of the critic against the dialogue model. And the chapter begins with Mia, my inner atheist, quoting from Lawrence Krauss, where he says this: "I've challenged theologians to give me a single example of a contribution to human knowledge that theology has provided in the last 500 years. And when I talk to major theologians, believe it or not, the answer I always get is, what do you mean by knowledge?" And then Krauss goes on and he kind of criticizes that. He thinks that the theologian is just fudging, right? That they just want to avoid the question because theology doesn't really make advances in knowledge. I think that both Krauss and the theologian are right here in different ways. The theologian is right to ask, well, what do you mean by knowledge? Because there are many spheres where theology, I think, does make contributions in the way that we think about all sorts of questions. And insofar as you have grounds to believe those claims are true, and I think there can be all sorts of grounds to think that they're true, I think you can say, yeah, that's an increase in knowledge. Underlying this, I think we have to be clear that knowledge does not require universal assent. In other words, in order to know something, it does not have to be the case that everybody agrees about what you know. There are always going to be people who disagree and have a different take on reality. So insofar as there is an assumption about a requirement of universal consent being required for true knowledge to obtain, you can throw that out the window. In fact, the very requirement of universal assent is itself not universally assented to. I don't assent to it. So it's sort of self-defeating at that point. So I think theology does make all sorts of knowledge claims that we can accept in justified way as theologians. But to go back to the question, so when Krauss says a single example of a contribution to human knowledge, what is one example? I think that he is onto something here, which brings me back to my critique of the dialogue model. The critique is this, that when he says a contribution to knowledge, I think really what he's meaning is scientific knowledge, the kind of knowledge about the nature and structure and processes of the natural world as studied by science. What contributions has theology made to that inquiry? And I think that his intuitions are basically right here. I can't believe I'm saying this about Lawrence Krauss with respect to theology, but on this point, I think he's onto something, that there is no symmetry here. Theology is not making comparable new advances into our understanding of nature in the same way that science is. And so insofar as this is conceived as a dialogue, these two different approaches to reality, each yielding particular insights that must shape the other, I don't think that you have that in the way that the advocates of the dialogue model often envision it. So then the question is, well, how should we think about theology? And let me quote from the book, because then I explain what I think theology is. Oh, actually, in fact, before I do that, let me just say that people who do think in this model from a theological perspective do try to give examples where theology made advances that were then recognized later by science. And so I think the best example I can come up with is a famous illustration from Robert Jastrow's book, God and, I think it's called God and the Astronomers, or God and the, yeah, I think it's God and the Astronomers, published 1980. Jastrow is talking about the rise of Big Bang cosmology throughout the 20th century. And in Big Bang cosmology, certainly as it was understood by Robert Jastrow, and this is an understanding that's very much contended or disputed today, but as he understood it 40 some years ago, the Big Bang committed one to an absolute beginning of the universe. And so then Jastrow takes this view and he says, okay, science in the middle 20th century has lighted upon the idea that there's an absolute beginning of the universe. But theologians were talking about an absolute beginning of the universe for centuries with respect to the doctrine of creation. And so he gives this fanciful image. He says, the scientist is climbing the mountain of ignorance. And as he or she labors up the side of the mountain and they finally crest the summit of the mountain, they find a group of theologians who have been sitting there for centuries. Jastrow's provocative point is that, in fact, theologians did predict a finite beginning of the universe, that the universe is not infinitely old, that it hasn't always existed, that it had an absolute beginning point. And scientists are now, from their perspective, only converging upon that same point in the 20th century. And so that's Jastrow's example. And so when I, in the past, would sort of assume this dialogical model of theology and science, and thus the credibility of theology, it would be dependent upon saying there are examples where theologians have anticipated a position that would later be adopted by scientists, much as the scientist adopts a neo-Darwinian account of biological diversity on Earth. So the theologians lighted upon an absolute beginning of the universe, and the other side later on converged on that same point. So you have a dialogical model here. And I think that that's just mistaken. For at least for two reasons. So one reason, well, more than two reasons, but let me start by saying this. The first thing is that this sort of then requires theology, for its own credibility, to be making a significant number of these kinds of advances. And as I've said, I just don't think that that is the case. The second point I would make is I think that there is an important asymmetry here that Jastrow misses. That when the theologian changed their views on biological origins because of the advance of neo-Darwinian science, the theologian wasn't changing their views for independent theological reasons alone. They were clearly being forced to, in a sense, by the advances in biology, and they had to respond to those advances in biology. And that is clearly asymmetrical. That is not comparable to what happened in the absolute beginning of the universe. Big Bang cosmology did not win the day in the middle of the 20th century for theological reasons. It won the day for scientific reasons. Because of things like the discovery of redshift in the 1920s and background radiation, and even the predictive suggestiveness of Einstein's theory of relativity. Those were some of the catalysts for the rise of Big Bang cosmology. So even if it is the case that theologians anticipated a finite origin of the universe, there was no causal connection. So it really wasn't a dialogue in that conventional sense. The science was doing its own thing and happened to lighten upon a particular view that was consonant with what some theologians had believed. It doesn't mean the theologians were impacting the scientists. So I think it's just a misreading of what is going on here. And this leads me finally back to conversations with my inner atheist, where I explain what I understand theology to be, and thus why the whole dialogical model, where each side needs to be having an equal contribution in the conversation and shaping the other, why that's just mistaken. So I say this: systematic theology is an integrative discipline. What the theologian is attempting to do is take Christian scripture as interpreted through and thereby informed by specific traditions, and interpret it in light of one's logical reasoning, moral reasoning, personal and communal experience, and the best Wissenschaft of the day. Now, Wissenschaft includes the generally accepted knowledge of the culture, including knowledge of natural science. But natural science is not doing that with respect to theology. It's not trying to integrate theological insights into its project. It's a different kind of project. It's not an interdisciplinary project that seeks to provide a unifying framework across multiple disciplines. Rather, natural science is a focused inquiry into the structure and processes of nature. That explains the asymmetry. So of course, I say, theologians will end up appealing to the results of science in their theologizing, while scientists won't appeal to theologians. One field is integrative and interdisciplinary, as it seeks to relate Christian doctrine to the best learning of the age, whereas the other inquiry is a focused investigation into nature. They are simply different disciplines with different fields of inquiry. To conclude, that is why ultimately the dialogical model as it is commonly conceived, where each side is making contributions to shape the other side in the conversation, is simply a misconstrual. It is an asymmetry, but there's nothing to apologize for because it is an asymmetry by nature. One of these disciplines, natural science, is a focused investigation. The other one, systematic theology, is an integrative discipline encompassing all of Wissenschaften and bring it into conversation with systematic theology and Christian doctrine.